There is a lake in the north of Italy that the old people of Bellagio will not cross after dark. They have their reasons, and they do not share them with strangers. On still nights, when the mist comes down off the mountains and lies along the surface like a second, paler lake, the fishermen stay in their houses with the shutters closed, and they do not look at the water. Also, you can listen to all of my stories on Spotify. The link will be in the description. On the promontory, where the lake divides itself into two long arms, there stood a villa of pale stone with green shutters, and its name was Villa d'Ombra, the Villa of Shadow. It had been built by a cardinal 300 years before, and it had passed through many hands, and now it belonged to an Englishman, and the Englishman was afraid. His name was Sir Edmund Harcourt, and on this night, the 14th of October in the year 1896, he stood at his window and watched the water as he had watched it every night for a month. He was a tall man once, though the years had bent him. His hands, resting on the sill, would not keep still. Below him the lake lay flat and black. The mist moved over it without any wind to move it. Then, out near the deep channel where the two arms of the lake met, something began to take shape. At first it was nothing, a trick of the moon on the fog, a heron perhaps, a fisherman's sail left to drift. But it did not drift. It came toward the shore, steady and slow and upright, a shape of white that stood upon the surface of the lake as a woman stands upon a floor. Then came the singing. It was very soft at first, carried across the water the way sound carries over water on a windless night, seeming near and far at once. A woman's voice, low and sweet and unbearably sad, singing a tune with no words that anyone in the villa could have named, and yet Sir Edmund Harcourt knew it. He knew it the way a man knows the sound of his own name spoken in the dark. He had heard that tune before. He had heard it 20 years ago, in this same house, sung by a woman who was now 20 years dead. He had heard it, and he had done everything in his power to make certain he would never hear it again. "Beatrice," he whispered. The name came out of him like something torn loose. "God forgive me, Beatrice." The figure lifted one pale arm and pointed, not at the villa, at him, at the one lit window on the whole dark face of the house, where an old man stood with his hand against the glass, and his heart hammering like a fist against a door. By the time he had steadied himself against the bedpost and forced himself to look again, the water was empty. The mist lay unbroken. There was no figure, no boat, no voice. There was only the lake, black and flat and patient, and the single lamp burning in the boathouse below, and the terrible certainty in the old man's chest that the dead do not forget, and that they do not forgive, and that they know the way home. The next morning, Sir Edmund Harcourt sat at his writing desk with a shaking hand and composed a letter. He did not write to the police, for he did not believe the police could help him with what was coming for him across the water. He wrote instead to the only man in Europe he could think of who might tell him, once and for all, whether he was being haunted by a ghost or hunted by something living. He addressed the letter to London, to a set of rooms on Baker Street, and he wrote, in a hand that would not hold steady, a single sentence that he underlined 3 times. "There is a dead woman walking on my lake, and she has come to take me down into it, and I do not know if I deserve to go." He did not know, as he sealed it, that he had less than 2 weeks to live. He did not know that the answer to his question would prove far stranger and far crueler than any ghost. And he did not know, though he would learn it at the very end, that the thing he feared most in all the world was not the woman on the water. It was the truth she had come to tell. To understand what happened at the Villa of Shadow that autumn, and to understand the quiet, patient cruelty that had waited 20 years for the mist to rise, we must begin where all such matters began in those years. We must begin in London, in a room where a fire burned against the fog, and where a man sat reading a letter from a stranger and was already, without quite knowing why, deeply interested. The autumn of 1896 had settled over London like a wet grey blanket, and Dr. John Watson had spent the better part of a fortnight watching his friend grow restless. There had been no case worth the name for 3 weeks. Sherlock Holmes without a problem to solve was a machine running without work to do, and the sound of it was not pleasant to live beside. He lay stretched in his chair with his eyes half shut and the pipe going, and he had not spoken in an hour. When Mrs. Hudson brought up the Morning Post, Watson watched his friend's long fingers riffle through it without interest, tossing bills and circulars onto the carpet until they stopped upon a single envelope of heavy cream-coloured paper. "Italy," said Holmes, turning it over. "Como, by the postmark." The paper is expensive and old, cut down from a larger sheet by a household economizing in the small things while pretending not to economize in the large. The hand is educated, English, and the writer was afraid when he wrote it. You can see it in the pressure. He bore down so hard on the underlining that the nib split. "You have not opened it," Watson observed. "I do not need to open it to read the man's condition, but I confess," said Holmes, and there was the faintest quickening in his voice, the first sign of life Watson had seen in him for days. "I do rather want to know what has frightened an Englishman so badly on the shores of the most beautiful lake in Europe." He read it once in silence, then he read it aloud, and the words that had seemed merely strange on the page took on a chill when spoken in that quiet, firelit room. A dead woman walking on his lake, a ghost that sang, a man who did not know whether he deserved to be taken down into the dark. "A frightened old man," said Watson. "Nerves, surely, a guilty conscience, and too much wine, and a fog on the water. Every lake in the world has its ghost story." "Every lake, yes," Holmes agreed. He set the letter down and pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin. "But not every ghost story is written by a man who signs himself with a title and a shaking hand and encloses, look, a bank draft for £200 and the cost of our passage. Men do not spend £200 to be told they have had a bad dream, Watson. They spend it because in their hearts they have already stopped believing it was a dream, and they cannot bear to be alone with the belief." "Then you think there is something to it?" "I think," said Holmes, rising and crossing to the window, where the rain ran down the glass in long grey threads, "that there is always something to it. A woman is dead, a man is afraid. 20 years lie between those two facts like a locked room, and somewhere in that room is the thing that has begun, this autumn, to walk. I should very much like to see inside that room." He turned, and for the first time in 3 weeks his eyes were bright. "Besides," he said, "your colour has been poor since the summer, and a physician who does not take his own advice is a poor advertisement for his trade. The air of the Italian lakes is said to be restorative. Let us go and be restored. And let us find out what walks on the water at Villa d'Ombra." They took the boat train 2 days later, crossing to Calais in a grey chop of Channel water, then south through France into the mountains as the country changed around them from wet grey to a clearer, harder light. Watson, who kept notes of everything in those years, recorded that Holmes spoke little on the journey, but that at Basel he did something Watson had seen him do 100 times, and which he never tired of watching. A young man had taken the table beside them, an Englishman by his clothes, perhaps 30 years of age, with an anxious manner and a leather case which he kept between his feet, and touched, from time to time, as if to reassure himself it had not moved. Holmes watched him for perhaps a minute, over the rim of his coffee. "That gentleman," Holmes murmured to Watson, "is a solicitor's clerk who has recently been dismissed, who is travelling south on money that is not his to spend, and who is carrying in that case something he intends to sell to a man he has never met. He is also, I am sorry to say, going to be disappointed. You cannot possibly know all that. The ink on the side of his right hand marks the clerk. The wear on his cuff marks the man who has done such work for years, not months. Yet his coat is new and ill-fitting, bought in haste, which a working clerk does not do unless his circumstances have changed suddenly. He touches the case for reassurance, so it holds his hope, not merely his shirts. And there is the corner of a pawn ticket in his waistcoat pocket, which tells me he has already sold what small things he owned. A man in that state, traveling to sell one last object to a stranger, is a man out of choices. Such men are always disappointed, Watson. It is the one certainty in an uncertain world. Watson laughed, as he always did, and Holmes did not. He watched the young man vanish into the crowd on the platform, and something in his face had gone thoughtful and cold. "You seem troubled by him," said Watson. "I am troubled," said Holmes slowly, "by the number of people in this world who are one bad autumn away from doing something they cannot undo. We are going to a house full of such people, Watson. I feel it already. A frightened man does not summon a detective, he summons a witness. He wants someone to see the thing that is happening to him before it finishes happening. I only hope we arrive in time to be more than that." They came down out of the mountains on the third day, into the soft gold light of the Italian lakes, and the country was so beautiful that it seemed impossible anything wrong could happen in it. Watson would remember that thought later, and remember how wrong it had been. For beauty, as Holmes would remind him before the week was out, is the finest hiding place of all. Nobody thinks to look for cruelty in a place that takes the breath away. The little steamer brought them across the lake as the light was failing, and Watson stood at the rail and watched the villa of shadow grow out of the promontory ahead of them. It was a beautiful house, and it was a sad one. He could not have said how he knew the second thing, for houses do not wear their grief where a man can see it, and yet he knew it as surely as he knew the first. There was a stillness about the place, a held breath, as though the villa were waiting for something and had been waiting a long time. They were met at the water steps by a manservant with a lantern who did not speak, and led up through terraced gardens gone slightly wild, past fountains that no longer ran, to a great door of black oak that opened before they reached it. In the hall beyond, beneath a painted ceiling of fading gods, a woman was waiting for them, and Watson's first thought was that she was the most composed person he had ever seen. Lady Cordelia Harcourt was perhaps 48, though she carried herself with the unhurried grace of a woman who has decided that time will not be permitted to touch her. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with a broad, calm brow and grey eyes that took in the two travellers with a frank and gentle interest, and she came forward with both hands extended as though they were old friends arriving late for a party. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you cannot know what it means that you have come." Her voice was low and even, an Englishwoman's voice with the edges worn smooth by long years abroad. "My husband has spoken of nothing else since he wrote to you. I will be honest with you, gentlemen, for I think honesty will serve us all best. I did not want him to send that letter. I thought it would only feed the thing that is eating him. But he is a man who must do something when he is afraid, and so—" She spread her hands, and the gesture took in the whole quiet house. "Here you are, and I find I am glad of it after all." Holmes bowed over her hand and said the correct things, and while he said them his eyes were everywhere at once. Watson knew the look. His friend was reading the room the way another man reads a newspaper, and later, when they were alone, he would tell Watson what he had read. For now Watson noticed only what Holmes made no show of noticing, which was that Lady Cordelia wore a locket at her throat, an old-fashioned thing of tarnished silver, and that she wore it turned inward, so that the face of it lay hidden against her skin, as some women wear a locket that holds a portrait too private to be seen. Sir Edmund came down to them slowly, one hand never leaving the banister, and the sight of him confirmed everything the letter had promised. He had been a big man once, and the ruin of that bigness hung on him now like a coat cut for someone else. His face was grey, and his eyes were red-rimmed and would not settle, and when he took Holmes's hand, he held it a moment too long, the way a drowning man holds a rope. "You believe me," he said. It was not quite a question. "You have come, so you must believe there is something to believe. My wife thinks I am mad. My doctor thinks I am ill. My nephew thinks I am in my dotage and a nuisance to everyone. But you came all the way from London, so you at least allow that a man might be telling the truth when he says he has seen the dead." "I allow," said Holmes gently, "that you have seen something. What it is we shall determine." "I have found in my career that the dead very rarely walk, Sir Edmund, but the living walk a great deal, and they are far more dangerous, and they are given to dressing themselves in the clothes of the dead when it suits their purpose. Let us have no talk of madness. Let us have facts. Tell me first who lives in this house." The household of Villa Dombra, Watson learned that evening over a dinner eaten in a strained and careful quiet, was a small and complicated thing. There was Sir Edmund, master of the house and its fear. There was Lady Cordelia, his wife of 18 years, who managed everything and betrayed nothing. There was Julian Harcourt, the master's nephew, and, in the absence of any son, his heir, a well-made young man of 36, with a charming smile and restless hands and the particular hunted look that Watson, who had known men ruined at the gaming tables, recognized at once. And there was one more. She sat at the far end of the table, silent through the whole meal, a young woman of perhaps 26, with a pale, still face and dark eyes that rested, again and again, upon her father. This was Vivian Harcourt, Sir Edmund's daughter, and the only child of his first marriage. She was the daughter of the woman who had drowned in the lake 20 years before. She was the daughter of Beatrice. She did not eat, she did not speak, unless spoken to, and when she was spoken to, she answered in a low, clear voice before falling silent again. Watson thought at first that she was simply a shy young woman oppressed by a grim house. But there was nothing shy in the way she watched her father. It was a steady, patient, measuring watchfulness, the look of a person waiting for something, and Watson found that when he caught her eye by accident, it was he who looked away first. Two others completed the house, though they did not sit at the table. Signora Benedetti, the housekeeper, an old woman in unrelieved black who had served the family since before the First Lady Harcourt died, and who moved through the rooms like a piece of the furniture that had learned to walk. And down at the water, Matteo, the boatman, a silent, weathered man of the lake, who tended the little fleet of skiffs, and who, Watson would later learn, had been the one to pull Beatrice Harcourt's body from the water on the morning after she drowned. They were joined at the end of the meal by Dr. Alessandro Ferrara, the physician from Bellagio who attended Sir Edmund, a spare, intelligent, courteous man who spoke excellent English and who drew Watson aside almost at once, one medical man to another, with a frankness that told Watson he had been wanting to speak to someone of his own kind for some time. "You will forgive me, doctor," Ferrara said quietly, "but I am glad another physician is in the house. Sir Edmund's heart is not strong. It has not been strong for years. I treat him with digitalis, the foxglove, as you would yourself, and in ordinary circumstances he might live a long while yet. But these are not ordinary circumstances. A weak heart and a great terror, Dr. Watson, are a poor pairing. I have seen men frightened to death. I do not say it as a figure of speech. I have signed the certificates. If this haunting continues much longer, I do not think my medicines will save him. I think one night the fear will simply stop his heart, and there will be nothing I or you or Mr. Holmes can do about it." Watson thanked him and filed the warning away, and did not yet understand its importance. He noticed only, as he turned back to the room, that Lady Cordelia was watching the two doctors from across the hall with a still and careful attention, and that when she saw Watson notice her, she smiled a warm and gracious smile and looked away, and touched, once with 2 fingers, the locket at her throat. When the household had gone up to bed, Sir Edmund took Holmes and Watson into his study, poured himself a glass of wine with a hand that spilled a little of it on the desk, and told them the story he had spent 20 years trying not to tell anyone, including himself. He had married Beatrice, he said, when they were both young, and he was not yet the wreck they saw before them now. She had been a northern girl, from the fells above the lakes of Cumberland, with a wildness in her that he had loved and, in the end, been unequal to. She sang. That was the thing he came back to, again and again as he spoke. She was always singing, little tunes from her childhood, lullabies her own mother had sung, songs with no words that she made up as she went along, and the house had been full of her voice from morning to night. "We came here for her health," he said. "The London winters did not agree with her chest. We took this house, and for a few years we were happy, or I believed we were, which a man tells himself is the same thing. Vivian was born here. After that," he stopped. His hand found the wine again. "After that it began to go wrong between us, the way these things do, slowly, so that you cannot point to the day it started. There was a coldness. There were quarrels. I will not pretend to you that I was a good husband at the end, Mr. Holmes. I drank. I have always drunk when I am unhappy, and I was very unhappy, and I said things to her that—" He did not finish. He drank instead, and when he set the glass down, his hand was steadier, as though the wine had given him just enough courage to say the rest. "The night she died, there was a storm, a real one, the kind that comes down off the mountains in the autumn and turns the lake to iron. We had quarrelled, badly, the worst of all our quarrels, and I do not remember all of it, because I was very drunk, Mr. Holmes, drunker than I had ever been. I remember her face. I remember shouting. I remember following her down through the garden in the rain toward the water, because she said she would take a boat and leave me that very night, storm or no storm, and I could not let her, and I went after her." He pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes. "And there my memory ends. There is nothing after that, nothing until the grey of the morning, when Matteo came up to the house, white as a sheet, and said he had found her." "Where?" said Holmes quietly. "Did he find her?" "Out by the deep channel, where the 2 arms of the lake meet, near half a mile from the boathouse. She had gone into the water, and the water had taken her out, they said, into the deep part where it is cold and black, and has no bottom that any man has found. Matteo brought her in. There was an inquest. The verdict was misadventure. A woman gone out in a boat in a storm, in the dark, distressed and drowned. That was the finding. That is what the law says happened." "And what," said Holmes, "do you say happened?" For a long moment, Sir Edmund did not answer. The rain had grown heavy against the window, and the fire had burned low, and when at last he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Watson had to lean forward to catch it. "I say I killed her." The words fell into the room like stones into deep water. "I followed her down to the boathouse in a rage. I remember reaching for her on the steps, on the wet stone steps above the water, and I say that in my drunkenness and my anger I pushed her, or I let her fall, or I did not catch her when I could have, and she went into the lake, and I was too drunk and too much a coward to go in after her. That is what I have believed for 20 years, Mr. Holmes. That is the ghost that walks on my lake. It is my wife, come back from the deep water to take me down into it at last. And the terrible thing, the thing I cannot bear, is that I believe I deserve to go." Holmes let the silence hold for a while. Then he asked, in the mild tone of a man asking after the weather, a question that seemed to Watson entirely beside the point. "You followed her to the boathouse steps. Tell me, Sir Edmund." In the 20 years since that night, how many times have you gone out upon the lake yourself?" Sir Edmund looked up, startled out of his grief. "Out on the lake? Why, never, not once. I cannot swim, Mr. Holmes. I have feared deep water since I was a boy. I have not set foot in a boat in 20 years. I cannot even bear to walk along the water on a dark night. The lake and I have an understanding. It keeps my wife, and I keep to the land." "I see," said Holmes, and he said nothing more about it. And Watson, watching him, knew that his friend had just been handed something he considered important and had chosen to fold it away out of sight. It would be some days before Watson understood what it was. There was a knock, and the old housekeeper, Signora Benedetti, came in with a candle to ask whether the master needed anything more, and Holmes, who never let an opportunity pass, rose and was gentle with her and asked her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, whether she remembered the First Lady Harcourt. The old woman's face, which had been closed and careful, changed at the name. Something moved in it, grief, and something harder than grief. "I remember her, signore. I dressed her for her grave with these hands. There was no one else who would do it properly." She looked at Sir Edmund, and there was reproach in the look, old and worn but not forgotten. "She was good to me. She sang to my grandchildren, and when they took her out of the water, do you know what they had done? They had taken her locket, her mother's locket that she wore always, that she never once took off in all the years I knew her. Silver, with a little bird upon it, a kingfisher, worked into the metal. It was on her throat living, and it should have been on her throat dead, and it was gone. The water took it, they said. But I dressed her, signore. I know what the lake gives back and what it keeps. The lake does not unclasp a chain from a woman's neck. Someone's hands did that, someone's living hands." "That will do, Benedetti," said Sir Edmund sharply, and the old woman bowed her head and withdrew, and the master turned to Holmes with a tired, apologetic gesture. "She has told that story for 20 years. The locket, the locket. It fell into the lake with everything else, of course. Grief makes people cling to small things. Pay her no mind." But Holmes paid her a great deal of mind, though he showed none of it. He stood at the window a long while after Sir Edmund had gone up to his bed, looking out at the water where a dead woman was said to walk, and when Watson asked him what he made of it all, he answered without turning round, "I make of it that a man who cannot swim and has not entered a boat in 20 years believes he drowned his wife in the deep channel 1/2 mile from shore. I make of it that a locket, which never left a living woman's throat, was gone from her drowned one. And I make of it, Watson, that we have been brought here to lay a ghost, when what we have found is very much older and colder than any ghost. Go to bed. Tomorrow I want to see this lake by daylight, and I want to see the boathouse, and I want very much to meet the woman who walks upon the water. For she is a woman, Watson, of that at least I am already certain." By daylight the lake was a different thing altogether, and it was hard, standing on the sunny terrace with the mountains sharp and blue across the water, to believe that anything walked upon it in the dark. Holmes spent the morning as Holmes always spent the first morning of a case, which is to say he wandered about, apparently at random, looking at everything and explaining nothing, while Watson followed and tried to see what his friend was seeing. Before he would look at the water, Holmes asked to see the room. He had guessed, he told Watson afterward, that a house with a locked heart keeps its truest secrets there, and he was not wrong. At the end of an upper corridor there was a door that Sir Edmund unlocked with a key he carried always upon his person, and beyond it lay a room that time had not been permitted to touch. It was Beatrice's room, her sitting room, kept for 20 years exactly as she had left it on the night she died, the books still open where she had set them down, a shawl still across the arm of a chair, a hairbrush upon the table with, Watson saw with a chill, a few long dark hairs still caught in its bristles. The old man stood in the doorway, and would not come inside. He had not entered the room, he said, since the morning they brought her home. Above the mantel hung a portrait, and it had been turned to face the wall. Holmes turned it gently back, and the three men looked up at the face of the woman who had drowned. Beatrice Harcourt had been painted in the fullness of her happiness, a dark-haired woman with laughing eyes and a wide, generous mouth, caught as though she were about to speak or to sing. And Watson felt the hair rise on his neck, for he had seen that face before. He had seen it at the dinner table, pale and silent and grieving. He had seen it, he realized now, out on the black water in the dead of night, upright and terrible in trailing white. The daughter was the image of the mother. Vivian Harcourt was Beatrice Harcourt, made young again, and Watson understood in that moment why the phantom on the lake had struck such terror into the old man's heart. It was not merely the song, it was the face. A father, half mad with guilt and drink and fear, had looked out across the water and seen, rising from the mist, the living likeness of the wife he believed he had drowned. Holmes said nothing of this aloud, but Watson saw him look from the portrait to the door, and knew that his friend had made the same connection, and had filed it away with all the rest. He examined the room for some minutes in silence, and he lingered longest over a small writing desk, its drawers empty, its surface bare, where a woman might once have kept a diary. Then he thanked Sir Edmund, and the old man locked the door again with a hand that shook, and they went down at last into the morning to see the lake. He examined the boathouse for a long time. It was an old stone building at the foot of the garden, half in and half out of the water, and it sheltered 3 small boats. Matteo the boatman was there, mending a net, and he watched Holmes with the flat, incurious patience of a man who has seen many gentlemen come and look at things and go away again none the wiser. Holmes asked him, through a little Italian and a good deal of gesture, how deep the water was at the landing. Shallow, Matteo indicated. A man could wade there, and out beyond? He swept his arm toward the middle of the lake and shook his head slowly. There, the gesture said, there is no bottom at all. Holmes stood at the end of the landing and looked out along the water, and Watson saw him note something, though he could not tell what. There was a place, perhaps 40 yards out, where the colour of the water changed, where the bright blue of the deep gave way to a paler, greener band that ran in a long curve parallel to the shore before dropping off again into darkness. A sandbar, said Holmes, half to himself. The old jetty, I should think, fallen and drowned long ago, now silted into a bank just beneath the surface. Matteo, is it so? Can a person stand out there on the pale water? The old boatman looked at Holmes for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice was flat. A man who knew the lake, he said, might stand out there in water no higher than his knees, on a calm night, if he knew exactly where the old jetty lay. But no one knew that now. He said it too firmly, and he turned back to his net, and Holmes thanked him pleasantly and said nothing at all about the fact that the man had just told a lie, because his eyes, when he denied that anyone knew where the jetty lay, had gone for the briefest instant up the garden toward the house, toward a high window, before he mastered them and looked away. Watson followed the direction of that glance, and saw, for a moment only, a pale face at a high window of the villa, watching them at the water. Then a shutter moved, and the face was gone, and Watson could not have sworn afterward whose face it had been. But he thought it had been the daughter's. He thought it had been Vivian's. Inside the boathouse, Holmes found 3 things that interested him, and he pointed out none of them to Matteo. The first was that the lamp which burned there every night, the lamp Sir Edmund watched from his window, could be seen from the water for a great distance, and would serve a person out on the lake as perfectly as a lighthouse serves a ship, telling them precisely where the shore lay, and precisely which window above was lit. The second was a wooden peg on the inner wall, at shoulder height, worn smooth and pale, as though something were hung there often and taken down often, and the third was a coil of rope hung on its hook that had been coiled by someone who did not coil ropes for a living. Matteo's other ropes were coiled clockwise, tight and even, the work of a lifetime on the water. This one was coiled the other way, loose and clumsy, the work of someone in a hurry and in the dark. "Someone uses this boathouse at night," said Holmes softly, when Matteo had gone up to the house, "who is not the boatman, and who takes a boat out and brings it back, and hangs a wet garment on that peg to dry, and coils the rope wrong, because they are not used to coiling it, and their hands are cold. That is not a ghost, Watson. Ghosts do not coil rope at all." But he was not yet ready to watch. First, he said, he wished to understand exactly what it was they would be watching, for a thing understood by daylight holds no terror by dark. He led Watson out along the shore to a low shelf of rock, from which the whole sweep of the water lay open, and he set about taking the phantom apart the way he had taken apart the boathouse, calmly and piece by piece. "Consider the reports," he said. "The figure appears to stand upon the surface of the lake, some 40 yards from shore. It appears to rise out of the water and to sink back into it. It sings, and the song carries clear across the water to the house, and it shows itself only on certain nights, and only, if Sir Edmund is to be believed, when the old man himself is watching from his window." Each of these marvels, said Holmes, had its plain answer, and the answers all lay in the water before them. The figure stood upon the surface, because just there, beneath a few inches of water, ran the drowned jetty, a ridge of old stone the villagers had shown him, firm enough to bear a walking woman and invisible from the house against the dark water. A figure upon it would seem, from the shore, to stand upon the lake itself. It appeared to rise and to sink, because the one who walked there came and went, not by boat in plain view, but low in a dark skiff, kept close against the black shadow of the promontory, stepping onto the ridge and off it, so that from the villa she seemed to melt up out of the water and down into it. And the song carried because sound travels far and clear over still water at night, as any fisherman knows, so that a voice pitched low from 40 yards out would reach the high windows of the house, as though it were whispered at the sill. "As for why the phantom appeared only when the old man watched," said Holmes, "that was the coldest part of the whole design, and the part that told him most about the one who had made it. The figure did not come when Sir Edmund happened to be watching. Sir Edmund watched and was made to keep watching, because the figure came only when a lamp burned in his window. Someone in this house, or close to it, was signalling out across the water which nights to walk and which to stay hidden, and someone was making very sure that the terror fell upon that one old frightened man and upon no one else. This was not the work of a vengeful spirit, Watson. It was the work of a living mind, patient and exact, that knew this house and this old man and this water intimately, and that wanted something from his fear. To be certain, Holmes did a simple thing. He sent Watson up to the terrace by the house, a good 40 yards off. Then he stepped out of his boots and waded out along the hidden ridge until he stood upon it, and Watson, looking back from the terrace, felt his own reason waver for an instant, for there upon the bright afternoon water stood the tall, dark figure of his friend, to all appearance standing upon the surface of the lake, with no boat and no support beneath him. It was, Watson admitted, uncanny, even by daylight, even knowing the trick of it. By night, in the mist, with a woman in white and a dead woman's song, it would freeze the blood of a guilty man. When Holmes waded back and pulled on his boots, he was grave. "Now I know how it is done," he said. "Tonight, I mean to learn who does it. Now, let us do the one thing everyone in this house has told us not to do. Let us watch the water tonight. and see who comes." They took up their station among the black cypresses on the terrace a little before midnight, and they waited. The moon rose late and thin behind a rack of cloud, and the mist came down off the mountains just as Sir Edmund had described it, lying along the water in a pale, unmoving sheet. The cold got into Watson's bones. The single lit window burned above them, where an old man kept his terrified vigil, and the boathouse lamp burned below, and between them lay the black and patient water. It was near 1 in the morning when Watson felt Holmes's hand close hard on his arm. He looked, and his breath stopped in his throat. Out on the water, where the mist lay thickest, a shape was forming. It rose out of the fog slowly, pale and tall and upright, and it stood upon the surface of the lake where no boat was, and it began, without any haste at all, to move toward the shore. Then the singing began, and Watson, who was not a fanciful man and who had faced death on 3 continents, felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. It came across the water low and sweet and heartbroken, a wordless tune that seemed to grieve for something lost beyond all finding, and it was so human and so sorrowful that it was worse, somehow, than any shriek could have been. Above them, at the lit window, Watson heard a sound he would not forget. It was Sir Edmund. The old man was weeping and calling a name into the dark, over and over. "Beatrice, Beatrice, forgive me." Holmes did not move a muscle. He watched the figure with the cold, intent absorption of a naturalist observing a rare bird, and when the white shape had come as near the shore as the sandbar allowed, and raised its pale arm toward the weeping man at the window, Holmes leaned close to Watson's ear and whispered 4 words that broke the spell more completely than any daylight could have done. "She is standing," he breathed, "on the sandbar, and she is singing a lullaby that only this family knows. Ghosts, Watson, do not need to stand on anything, and the dead do not learn new songs. That woman out there is alive. She has been in this house, and she loved the First Lady Harcourt well enough to have learned her every tune. We are not looking at a haunting, we are looking at a grief so patient and so terrible that it has waited 20 years to speak. The only question left is what it means to say." And with that, the figure sank back into the mist as smoothly as it had risen, and was gone, and the water lay empty and black beneath the thinning fog. Above them, the old man's window went dark at last. Holmes rose stiffly from his cramped hiding place, and there was no triumph in his face, only a deep and growing disquiet. "Come," he said, "we have seen enough for one night. Tomorrow I must find out who in this house learned to love a dead woman's songs, and why she has chosen this autumn, of all the autumns in 20 years, to sing them back to the man who thinks he killed her. There is a clock ticking somewhere in this business, Watson. I can hear it. I only wish I knew how much time it has left to run." Sir Edmund did not come down to breakfast. He had passed a bad night, Lady Cordelia told them, and Dr. Ferrara had been sent for. She said it calmly, buttering her bread, and her calm was so complete that Watson found himself studying it the way one studies a smooth sheet of water and wonders what lies beneath. At the far end of the table, Vivian sat pale and silent as before, and if she had been out upon the lake in a white gown at 1 in the morning, singing to break her father's heart, there was no sign of it on her now. She looked, Watson thought, simply tired. Tired to the bone, in the way of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. It was Julian who drew Watson's attention that morning. The nephew was too cheerful by half, talking a great deal and eating nothing, and there was a raw scrape across the knuckles of his right hand that he kept turning out of sight. When Holmes remarked pleasantly upon the injury, Julian laughed and said he had slipped on the terrace steps in the dark, coming in late from a walk, and Holmes said how unfortunate, and passed the marmalade, and said nothing more. But afterward, on the terrace, he was thoughtful. "A man who slips on steps," said Holmes, "grazes his palms, Watson, because he puts his hands out flat to catch himself. He does not scrape the backs of his knuckles. The backs of the knuckles are grazed by one thing above all others, and that is striking them against something or someone. Our Mr. Julian did not fall last night. He struck a blow, or was struck, or forced a lock, or climbed where he had no business climbing, and he is, at this moment, paying a servant to hold his tongue about something. I should very much like to know what a charming young heir does at night that leaves marks on his hands and requires the buying of silence." Holmes went down to Bellagio that afternoon on the pretext of posting a letter, and he was gone some hours, and when he returned, his face had the particular satisfaction of a man who has found exactly what he expected to find and taken no pleasure in being right. Julian Harcourt, it appeared, was drowning. Not in the lake, but in debt, which drowns a certain kind of man just as surely and a good deal more slowly. He owed money in 3 towns. He owed it to the sort of men who do not go to law to collect, because they have swifter methods. And he had been heard, in the card rooms of the resort hotels along the lake, to say more than once, and more than sober, that his troubles would all be over the moment his uncle did the decent thing and died. "Consider the young man's position," said Holmes, and Watson could not tell from his tone whether he believed what he was laying out or was merely testing its weight. "He is the heir. There is no son. When the old man dies, Julian inherits the estate, the villa, everything, and his troubles are over. But there is a difficulty. The old man is not dying fast enough, and worse, the old man is terrified, and a terrified man is an unpredictable man. A terrified man might do anything. He might, for instance, change his will. He might leave everything to the daughter he has neglected for 20 years, out of guilt, to make amends before he goes. If Julian believed that were about to happen, then Julian would have the strongest motive in the world to hurry matters along, and to do it now, this autumn, before the will could be changed." "You think Julian is the phantom," said Watson. "I think," said Holmes, "that it would be very convenient for Julian if his uncle were frightened to death by a ghost. There would be no blow struck, no poison, no hangman, merely an old man with a weak heart, dead of fear, and a doctor to sign the certificate. If I wished to murder a man with a weak heart and never be suspected, I could imagine no cleaner method than to convince him he was being haunted, and to wait. It is nearly perfect, Watson. It requires no weapon but terror, and terror leaves no marks." "And yet," said Holmes, and he frowned, "and yet it does not fit. The woman on the water sings a lullaby that only the family knows. Julian is the old man's nephew. He came to this house a grown man, long after the First Lady Harcourt was dead. He never heard her sing. He could no more reproduce that tune than you or I could. Whoever walks on the water learned those songs at the knee of a woman 20 years in her grave, which Julian assuredly did not. No, Julian schemes at something in the dark, and Julian wishes his uncle dead, and Julian will bear the closest watching. But Julian is not the phantom. The phantom is someone who loved Beatrice, and that, Watson, is a very different and a very much sadder thing." That night, Watson could not sleep, and walking the dark corridor toward the stairs for a glass of water, he saw a light moving ahead of him, a candle carried low, and he followed it without quite deciding to. The floorboards creaked and groaned beneath him, betraying every step, but the figure ahead did not turn. It went down the great stair and along the ground floor passage to the door of Sir Edmund's study, and there it stopped, and Watson, pressed into the shadow of an alcove, watched a hand try the study door, find it locked, and begin, very quietly, with a thin blade of steel, to work at the lock. Watson's heart was pounding. He had almost decided to call out when the lock gave with a soft click, and the figure took up the candle and slipped inside, and in the moment that the candlelight swung up across the intruder's face, Watson saw who it was. It was Julian. The nephew was breaking into his uncle's study in the dead of night, and Watson, who had a service revolver but no wish to raise the house on a guess, drew back into the shadows to watch what the young man would do. Through the gap of the door, Watson watched Julian search the study with the frantic efficiency of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for and has very little time to find it. He went through the desk drawers one by one. He held papers to the candle and cast them aside, and at last he found what he sought, a long document folded in blue paper, and he read it there in the wavering light, and Watson saw his face change, saw the hope drain out of it, and something colder come into its place. Then Julian folded the paper, put it back exactly where he had found it, and stood a moment in the dark with his hands pressed flat upon the desk, and even from the corridor, Watson could see that the young man was shaking. When Julian had gone, Watson roused Holmes and told him all of it, and Holmes listened without interrupting, lying back with his eyes closed, and at the end he was silent for a long time. "A will," he said at last. He was reading the will, and what he read frightened him. Either the old man has already changed it, and Julian has just learned that he inherits nothing, or the old man has not yet changed it, and Julian has just confirmed that he still inherits everything, and now has every reason to make sure the change never comes. I cannot yet tell which, but I will tell you this, Watson. Whichever it is, the clock I heard ticking has just begun to run faster. A desperate man has read a document in the dark, and desperate men do not read. They act. We must move quickly now. I fear we may already be moving too slowly. Holmes had learned long ago that the memory of a village is longer than the memory of any court, and so he spent the next morning not among the family, but among the fishermen of Bellagio, buying wine for old men on the quay and letting them talk. It took patience, and it took Watson's small store of Italian stretched to its limit, but by noon Holmes had found what he wanted, which was the oldest fisherman on the lake, a man named Cesare, with a face like a walnut and eyes still sharp as a boy's, who had fished these waters for 60 years, and who remembered, when the name was spoken, the morning they had found the Englishwoman. "I remember," the old man said, and he pointed a knotted finger out toward the middle of the lake, toward the pale band where the two arms met. "Out there she was, God rest her, in the deep water by the drowned jetty. Matteo found her first, but I was not far behind in my boat, and I helped him bring her in. 20 years, and I have not forgotten. You do not forget a thing like that." Holmes did not hurry him. He let the old man find the memory in his own time, and Cesare, looking out at the water, gave it to him piece by piece. It had been just after dawn, he said, the lake dead calm, the way it goes after a storm, the mist lying on it like a shroud. Matteo had gone out early, before anyone, as though he had known, and it was Matteo who found her, out by the drowned jetty, floating face down in her white nightgown, with her dark hair spread upon the water. Cesare had heard him cry out across the still lake, a sound he would carry to his own grave, and had rowed to him, and together the two men had lifted her into Matteo's boat, for she was small, and the water had not yet done to her what the water does. Matteo had held her the whole way in, the old man said, and had not let the other men take her from him at the quay, and had wept like a child, though he was a grown man and a hard one, for everyone on the lake had known that Matteo loved the bright lady, hopelessly and from a great distance, as a poor man loves a star. And there was one thing, the old man said, that had always troubled him, though he had never spoken of it, for it was not his place, and the great people had their own ways. When they laid her in the boat, her throat was bare. Now everyone on the lake knew the bright lady's locket, the little silver bird she wore always at her neck, and touched when she was thinking, a pretty thing, an old thing, Her mother's he had heard. She was never without it. The children used to beg to see the little bird, and when they brought her from the water it was gone, chain and all. And Cesare had said to himself, "The lake takes what it wants. A clasp gives way. These things happen." But it had sat wrong with him all these years, for the gown was whole, and the ribbon still in her hair, and her rings still upon her fingers, and only the one thing gone, the one thing she loved best, the one thing worth the taking. "The lake," he said, "is not so particular a thief as that. The lake takes everything, or it takes nothing. It does not reach into a drowned woman's collar and lift out the single silver locket and leave the gold rings on her hand." He crossed himself again and shrugged, as a man does who has carried a small wrongness a long time and made his peace with never understanding it. But Holmes understood it, and Watson, watching him receive this second witness to the missing locket, saw his friend go very still indeed. 2 witnesses now, 20 years and a household apart, an old servant in the house and an old fisherman on the quay, and neither knowing the other had spoken, and both saying the same impossible thing. The locket that never left the living woman's throat was gone from the drowned one. Holmes turned it over in his mind and set it beside all the rest, and said nothing of it to Cesare, and only bought the old man another bottle, and asked him, very gently, the question he had truly come all this way to ask. Holmes asked him, very gently, the question he had come all this way to ask. If a person went into the water at the boathouse steps below the villa, on a stormy night, in the dark, where would the lake carry them? The old man laughed, a short dry sound, as at a foolish question with an obvious answer. "Into the shallows," he said, "toward the village. Any child of the lake knew it. The current along that shore ran always the one way, southward, toward Bellagio, and it hugged the bank. A thing that went into the water at the villa steps would be found within a day against the reeds below the church, not half a mile out in the deep channel against the current. To reach the drowned jetty where the Englishwoman was found, he said, and he said it with the flat certainty of 60 years, a body would have to be carried out there, by a boat. There was no other way. The lake did not swim uphill." Watson, watching his friend, saw nothing move in Holmes's face at all, and knew therefore that something enormous had just moved behind it. Holmes thanked the old man and bought him another bottle and asked him one further question, as an afterthought, which was whether he remembered anything of the family in those days, of the household at the villa. And Cesare, warmed by the wine, remembered a good deal. He remembered the First Lady Harcourt, the one who drowned, a dark, laughing woman who sang on the water and gave the fishermen's children sweets. He remembered the little daughter, always at her mother's skirts, and he remembered the other one, the companion, the quiet Englishwoman in grey, who was always with the mistress and always a step behind her, so that the fishermen had a name for her among themselves. The Shadow, they had called her, because where the bright lady went, the grey shadow followed, and the shadow was as much at home upon the water as the mistress herself. That one, Cesare said, could handle a boat as well as any man on the lake. He had seen her row out alone, many mornings, in the grey light before the mistress woke. And when the mistress drowned, the shadow had stayed on, had married the widower in the end and become the mistress herself. Funny, the old man said, how these things go. The shadow becomes the substance. He crossed himself and drank, and would say no more. Holmes was very quiet on the walk back up to the villa. Watson, whose mind had begun at last to move along the same track as his friend's, put it into words because he could not bear to leave it unsaid. "The companion," he said, "the woman in grey who could handle a boat. She married Sir Edmund. She is Lady Cordelia." "She is Lady Cordelia," Holmes agreed. "And Sir Edmund cannot swim, and has not been in a boat in 20 years, and could not possibly have carried his wife's body half a mile out to the deep channel against the current. whatever he believes he did, on those steps in the dark. He could not, said Holmes. It is physically impossible. The thing he has confessed to, the thing he has believed for 20 years, the thing that is killing him by inches, he did not do. He could not have done it. Beatrice Harcourt did not go into the water at the boathouse steps. She was taken out to the deep channel in a boat by someone who could row and put into the deep water where the current could not bring her back, by hands that first unclasped a silver locket from her throat. And the only person in that household who could row, who was upon the water at all hours, and who profited beyond measure from the lady's death, was the quiet woman in grey who followed her everywhere like a shadow. They came up over the last rise of the garden, and there below them, on the bright water, was Lady Cordelia herself, alone in one of the little skiffs, rowing out toward the deep channel with long, easy, practiced strokes, her back straight, her oars entering the water without a splash. She looked utterly at home. She looked as though she had been born on the lake. And Watson, watching the woman who had greeted them with both hands and told them she was glad they had come, felt a coldness settle into him that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "She is not afraid of the deep water," Watson said quietly. "She is the only person in that house who is not." "No," said Holmes. "She is not afraid of it. Why should she be? She knows exactly what it holds, and she knows it will keep her secret, as it has kept it for 20 years. But something has changed, Watson. This autumn, after 20 years of silence, a woman began to walk upon that water and sing the drowned lady's songs. And Lady Cordelia, who fears nothing, has begun, I think, to be a little afraid at last. Not of ghosts. She does not believe in ghosts any more than I do. She is afraid of what the ghost means. She is afraid that someone knows. And a frightened murderer, Watson, who has kept a secret for 20 years and feels it slipping, is the most dangerous creature on God's earth. We must be very careful now, and we must be quick." She saw them on the terrace as she came up from the water, and she lifted one hand and waved to them, and called out something pleasant about the beauty of the morning, and smiled her warm and gracious smile. And Holmes lifted his hat and returned the greeting with every appearance of ease, and murmured, so that only Watson could hear, beneath his smile, "Wave back, Watson, smile. She must not know, not yet, that the shadow has been seen at last, for if she guesses what we know, someone in that house will die before morning, and I do not yet know how to prevent it." Holmes had said they must be quick, and yet he moved for the rest of that day with a deliberate slowness, for he understood better than anyone that to move too fast now was to lose everything. Before he could act against Lady Cordelia, he had to be certain of the whole shape of the thing, and there was one corner of it still in shadow. He had to understand the phantom. He had to know who walked upon the water, and why, and above all, what she wanted, because the woman on the lake was the loose thread in the whole design, and a loose thread, pulled at the wrong moment, can unravel a rescue as easily as a crime. He found his opportunity in the late afternoon, when Vivian went down alone to the water and stood at the very edge of the boathouse landing, looking out toward the deep channel with the stillness that Watson had noticed at the dinner table, the stillness of a person listening to something no one else could hear. Holmes went down to her quietly, and Watson followed a little way behind, and Holmes did not trouble her with any pretense. He simply came and stood beside her and looked out at the water, and after a while he said, in a voice of great gentleness, that it was a hard thing to lose a mother to a lake, and harder still to lose her twice. She did not pretend not to understand him. She looked at him for a long moment with her dark, steady eyes, and something in her seemed to give way. Some long-held weight set down at last, and when she spoke, her voice was low and clear and terribly tired. "You know it is me," she said. It was not a question. "The woman on the water. You have known since the first night, I think. You watch everything, Mr. Holmes. I have watched you watching." She turned back to the lake. "Are you going to tell my father?" Holmes said that he was not, and that he would very much like to understand, before he did anything at all, why a daughter would dress herself in white and row out upon the water in the dark to sing her dead mother's songs to the man who was slowly dying of the sound. And Vivian, standing at the edge of the water, where her mother had been carried down 20 years before, told him. She had been 6 years old when her mother drowned. She remembered almost nothing of that night, only torches on the water, and being carried away crying, and afterward a house that had turned to stone. Her father had never spoken of her mother again. He had shut the memory away, as a man shuts a room and locks the door, and the little girl had grown up in a house with a locked room at the heart of it, and had learned not to ask what was inside. She had been told her mother drowned by accident. She had believed it, because children believe what they are told, until the summer just passed, when the old housekeeper, Signora Benedetti, thinking herself near death from a fever, had pressed something into Vivian's hands and begged her forgiveness for keeping it hidden so long. It was her mother's diary. Beatrice had kept it in the last year of her life, and Benedetti had found it and hidden it and kept it out of guilt and fear for 20 years, and now, believing she was dying, could not bear to carry the secret into the grave. Vivian had read it 100 times since. She drew it now from within her shawl and held it out to Holmes, and Holmes took it with the reverence of a man handling something holy or something cursed, and turned to the final entries and read. The last entries were the entries of a frightened woman. Beatrice had written that she was afraid in her own house, that she felt watched, that someone close to her, someone she had trusted, had turned against her, and that she feared what this person might do, and that she meant to take Vivian and go to her people in the north before the autumn was out. She wrote that she had spoken of her fear to no one, for she had no proof, only the cold certainty a woman feels when another woman has begun to hate her. And there the diary ended, for the final pages, the pages that might have named the person Beatrice feared, had been torn out cleanly, long ago, by someone who had reached the diary before Benedetti hid it, and who had removed the one thing in all the world that could have hanged them. "You see, Mr. Holmes," said Vivian, and now the tears came, silent and unstoppable. "My mother was murdered. She wrote it herself. She was afraid, and she was going to run, and before she could run she went into the lake, and they called it an accident. Someone in this house killed her, and I have lived 20 years under the same roof as that person, and I did not know who it was, and I could not prove anything, and I thought I should go mad with it." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a childish gesture. "Then I thought, my father shut her away. My father never speaks of her. My father drinks himself sick with a guilt he will not name. Who else could it be? So I did the only thing I could think of. I became her. I put on white, and I learned to stand upon the drowned jetty, as Matteo taught me. God bless his loyal heart, for he loved her too. And I sang her songs to my father in the dark, night after night, to break him open, to force the truth out of him at last. I wanted him to confess. I wanted him to say her name and tell me what he did." Her voice broke entirely. "I never meant to kill him. I only wanted the truth. I am not even certain now that I want it any more." Holmes took her cold hands in his, which was not a thing Watson often saw him do, and he told her, with a quiet urgency that startled her out of her weeping, that she must stop, that she must not go out upon the water again, not once more, not for anything, that she had aimed her grief at the wrong door, and that the truth she was seeking was far crueler than the one she had imagined, and that if she loved her father, she must trust Holmes now and do exactly as he said. Vivian stared at him, uncomprehending, and began to ask what he meant, but Holmes had already turned away. his face set hard, and was striding up the garden toward the house with Watson hurrying after. At the door of the villa he came upon Dr. Ferrara, arriving on his afternoon visit, and Holmes seized upon him with a question that seemed to come from nowhere. Sir Edmund's heart medicine, the digitalis. Who administered it? Ferrara, taken aback, said that until recently he had overseen the dosage himself, or left it with the day nurse, for digitalis is a medicine that must be measured with great care. Too little does nothing. Too much, he said, and his professional calm faltered as he understood the direction of the question. Too much will stop the heart altogether, and stop it in a way that looks for all the world like the natural failure of a weak heart in an old and frightened man. And who, Holmes asked, administered it now? The nurse had been dismissed a fortnight since, Ferrara said slowly, as though the words were being drawn out of him against his will. Dismissed for economy, Lady Cordelia had said, and because the master would take his drops from no hand but his wife's. For the last 2 weeks, Lady Cordelia had measured and given Sir Edmund his heart medicine every night with her own hands, alone, in his room, before he slept. And no one, Ferrara whispered, no one but Lady Cordelia had seen the bottle, or knew how many drops went into the glass, in all that time. The weather turned that evening, as though the lake itself had been waiting. A storm came down off the mountains of the kind Sir Edmund had described, the kind that had ridden the sky the night his wife went into the water, and by nightfall the wind was in the cypresses, and the lake had gone the colour of iron, and the first thunder was rolling along the peaks. Holmes stood at the window of their room and watched it come, and his face was grim. "I do not like it," he said. "She has taken sole charge of the old man's medicine. She fears her secret is slipping, and today, God forgive me, I have shown my hand." I questioned Ferrara openly at the door of the house, where any servant might carry the word to her, and if she is half the woman I take her to be, she knows already that a doctor from London has begun to ask who measures the digitalis. That is a mistake, Watson, and it may prove a fatal one, and not to me. He turned from the window. A cornered murderer does not wait to be arrested. She will want the old man dead and buried, and the case closed before we can bring the authorities. She will want it done tonight, under cover of this storm, with the ghost to take the blame. We must not let him out of our sight. They took up their watch in the corridor outside Sir Edmund's room, in the deep shadow of a great carved press, and they waited while the storm rose to full fury outside. Beneath the old man's door, a line of lamplight showed, and once they heard him moving, and once they heard him cry out softly in his sleep, and the rain came against the windows in long, shuddering waves. It was near 11 when the lamplight under the door was joined by another, and Lady Cordelia came along the corridor in a dressing gown, with a candle in one hand and a small glass upon a saucer in the other, and she let herself into her husband's room and closed the door. Holmes's hand closed on Watson's arm like iron. Behind the door they heard the low murmur of Lady Cordelia's voice, soothing, tender, the voice of a devoted wife giving her sick husband his medicine, and they heard the old man answer her, querulous and afraid, and they heard the small chime of a spoon against a glass. Then the voices ceased, and there was a long quiet, and Watson realized he was holding his breath. When Lady Cordelia came out again, she carried the empty glass, and she paused in the corridor to trim her candle, and for one moment her calm, handsome face was lit full from below, and Watson saw upon it, plain and unmistakable, the faint, composed smile of a woman whose work is going well. She did not see them. She went away down the corridor to her own room, and her candle dwindled and was gone, and Holmes let out his breath at last. "The drops are given," he whispered. "I could not prevent it without showing myself, and if I show myself now, she will simply deny everything and we shall have nothing. But it may not be too late. Digitalis, given by the mouth, takes its time. If we can get to him, get an emetic into him, rouse Ferrara. Watson, your bag." But even as he spoke, from somewhere below and outside, thin and terrible through the roar of the storm, there came a sound that stopped them both. It was the singing, the lullaby, out on the water, in the teeth of the gale. "She has gone out again," breathed Holmes. "The daughter. I told her not to. I begged her, and she has gone out one last time in the storm." And within the room they heard Sir Edmund cry out, and heard the bed, and heard the old man's feet upon the floor, and Holmes flung open the door. The room was empty. The window stood open to the storm, the curtains streaming inward, and Sir Edmund Harcourt, drawn from his bed by the voice of the woman he believed he had murdered, had gone down through the house and out into the rain toward the water. They went down through the dark house at a run and out into the storm, and the rain hit them like a wall. The garden had become a chaos of thrashing black shapes. The cypresses bent double in the wind, and below them the lake heaved and gleamed under the lightning. And there, halfway down the terraced garden, stumbling and falling and dragging himself up again toward the water, was the frail white figure of the old man in his nightshirt, one arm outstretched toward the lake, calling a name that the wind tore away. Out on the water, impossibly, in that raging storm, the white figure stood upon the drowned jetty with the waves breaking around her knees, and she was singing still, and Sir Edmund was going down to her with his arms open and the tears and the rain streaming down his ruined face. Holmes and Watson ran, slipping on the wet steps, shouting into a wind that swallowed every word, and they were perhaps 20 yards away when the old man reached the boathouse landing and stopped and swayed and pressed both hands to his chest. "Beatrice!" he cried out, and his voice cracked and broke, and they were close enough now to hear it. "Oh God, forgive me. I let you fall. I reached for you, and I missed you, and I let you fall into the black water, and I have died a little every night for 20 years, and now you have come, and I am glad. I am glad. Take me down. I am so tired of the guilt. Take me down, and let it end." And with that his knees gave way beneath him, and he crumpled to the wet stone of the landing. And by the time Holmes reached him and turned him over, and Watson knelt in the rain with his fingers at the old man's throat, Sir Edmund Harcourt was gone. His heart, worn thin by 20 years of grief and driven past its limit by terror and by the poison in his blood, had simply stopped. He had died gazing at the ghost of his wife, begging her forgiveness, believing to his last breath that he was a murderer going at last to his judgment. Out on the water the white figure was gone, sunk back into the storm and the dark. Somewhere up the garden a light had appeared and was coming down toward them, and voices were calling. Holmes stood over the body of the man he had come to save, and had failed to save, bareheaded in the dying storm, and Watson had rarely seen him look so old. Lady Cordelia came down through the garden with a lamp, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose, and when she saw her husband lying dead upon the landing, she gave a low cry and sank down beside him and took his cold face in her hands and wept. And it was, Watson was forced to admit, a performance of flawless and convincing grief. The servants gathered, holding their lamps, murmuring and crossing themselves. Julian appeared at the edge of the crowd, white-faced, saying nothing, and of Vivian there was no sign at all. Holmes drew Watson a little apart, into the shadow beyond the lamplight, and his voice when he spoke was very quiet and very cold, all the grief gone out of it, replaced by something like fury held on a short chain. "She has done it," he said. "Under our eyes, in the middle of the storm, with the daughter's grief to hide behind, and the old man's own guilt to seal the lid. Heart failure, frightened to death by a ghost. Ferrara will not want to sign it, but he will find nothing he can prove, for digitalis, in an old man with a weak heart, leaves no accusation a court will hear. She has murdered her husband exactly as she murdered his wife 20 years ago, cleanly, patiently, and with the whole world ready to blame anyone but her. And the cruelest part of it, Watson, the part I can hardly bear, is that the poor child out on the water tonight believes, at this moment, that she has just killed her own father with the truth. She thinks she heard a murderer confess. She heard no such thing. She heard an innocent man take the blame for a crime he never committed and die of it. We must find her before that belief does to her what the digitalis did to him. The storm blew itself out before dawn, and the morning that came up over the mountains was washed and grey and terribly quiet. Sir Edmund's body had been carried up to the house and laid out, and Signora Benedetti, who had dressed the First Lady Harcourt for her grave 20 years before, now dressed the master for his, with the same grim, careful tenderness and the same silent tears. The house had drawn its curtains and gone still, but Holmes did not rest, for there were 3 things he had to do before the day was out, and the first and most urgent of them was to find Vivian. He found her at the water's edge, at the very end of the boathouse landing where her father had died, sitting on the wet stone with her white gown still clinging to her, soaked through, staring down into the grey lake that had taken her mother and now her father both. She had been there all night. She did not look up when they came. When Holmes spoke her name, she said, in a voice gone flat and strange, that she had heard him, that she had heard her father confess, that she had done what she set out to do and forced the truth from him at last, and the truth was that he had killed her mother, and the forcing of it had killed him, so that she had murdered her father to avenge her mother, and there was nothing left in the world for her now but the water. Holmes did not argue with her grief, and he did not leave her alone with it for a moment. He took her cold hands in both of his, and he made her look at him, and he told her, plainly and steadily, that everything she believed was wrong, that her father had confessed to a crime he did not commit, that he had died an innocent man carrying another's guilt, deceived for 20 years into believing himself the murderer, that the person who killed her mother was alive and warm and sleeping under this very roof, and had killed her father too, last night, with a poison in a glass, and that Vivian was not a murderer, but the one person whose courage had brought the truth within reach at last, and that he needed her now, needed her alive and steady and beside him, because he could not bring that person to justice without her. It was the word justice that reached her. Watson saw it land. The terrible flatness went out of her face, and something else came into it, grief still, and horror, but with a spine of purpose running through it now, and she let Holmes draw her up from the wet stone and lead her, shivering, back toward the house and the fire and the dry clothes and the living. Whatever Holmes had done in that quarter hour at the water's edge, Watson never quite knew, for his friend spoke of it to no one. But Vivian Harcourt came up from the lake that morning alive, and she stayed alive, and in the years afterward Watson counted it among the finest pieces of work he ever saw Holmes do, and not one word of it had anything to do with deduction. The second thing Holmes had to do was to secure the proof, and here he moved with quiet speed while the house was still in its first shock. He took Dr. Ferrara aside, and together they examined the body, and Ferrara confirmed, unhappily, what Holmes had feared. The signs were consistent with heart failure, as they would be in any case of digitalis poisoning, for the poison did its work by stopping the very heart it was meant to steady. There was nothing in the body alone that would convict anyone. But there was the bottle. Holmes had Ferrara retrieve the little bottle of heart drops from Sir Edmund's room before Lady Cordelia thought to remove it, and Ferrara, measuring what remained against what should have remained, given the dates and the doses he himself had prescribed, found that far more of the medicine was gone than a proper dosage could account for. Someone had been giving Sir Edmund a great deal more than his heart could bear, and only one person had held that bottle for a fortnight. "It is evidence," said Holmes, sealing the bottle away, "though not yet proof enough for a hanging. A clever counsel would say the old man dosed himself in his terror, or that the servant miscounted. I need more. I need the thing that ties her not only to last night, but to the night 20 years ago, so that the two deaths become one story that no jury can mistake. And for that, Watson, I need the locket." The third thing was to deal with Julian, for the nephew's midnight business still hung unexplained, and a good detective leaves no thread untied. Holmes found the young man alone in the drawing-room, drinking steadily and staring at nothing, and he put it to him directly. He knew of the debts. He knew of the break-in. He had watched Julian read the will in the dark. He would have the truth of it now, all of it, or he would give the young man's name to the authorities as a man who crept about his dying uncle's study at night. And Julian, cornered and grief-stricken and frightened, gave it to him. He had ruined himself at cards, he said, and worse than ruined, for the men he owed were not patient men. He had broken into the study to read the will. Yes, God help him, because he had needed to know whether he still stood to inherit, whether there was any hope of paying his debts before the men who held them lost their patience with him entirely. And what he had found had broken him, for his uncle had already signed a new will, not a fortnight since, leaving the villa and the greater part of the estate to Vivian, and to Julian only a small legacy and a letter begging him to reform. He had inherited almost nothing. He had crept about like a thief and struck a servant who caught him and paid another to keep quiet, and it had all been for nothing, because he was to be a poor man after all. He was ashamed, and he was ruined, and he was many contemptible things, he said, but he was not a murderer. He had loved his uncle in his careless way, and he had not touched him. Holmes believed him, and told him so, which seemed to steady the young man more than any comfort could have done. For a new will leaving everything to Vivian gave Julian no motive to kill his uncle now. Quite the reverse. If Julian had wished to inherit, he would have needed his uncle to live long enough to be persuaded to change the will back, not to die the very fortnight after signing it away. The nephew's guilt, which had loomed so large, collapsed entirely once the will was known. He was a weak and foolish and frightened young man, and he had done shameful things, but he had not killed anyone, and the marks upon his hands and the money paid for silence were the marks and the money of a coward, not a murderer. That left one person and one piece of proof still to secure. Holmes sat a long while in their room with the sealed bottle before him and his eyes closed, arranging it all, and when at last he spoke, it was to lay the whole design out for Watson from end to end, the way he liked to do before the final move, to test it for any crack. 20 years ago, he said, Cordelia Vane had been the companion of a bright and happy woman she had come to envy with all her cold and patient heart. She had wanted Beatrice's husband, and Beatrice's home, and Beatrice's place in the world. And so, on a stormy night, she had taken Beatrice out upon the water, by trick or by force, rowed her to the deep channel where the current would never bring her back, unclasped the silver locket from her throat as a keepsake or a trophy, and put her into the black water to drown. She had let the drunken, grieving husband believe that he had done it in his rage upon the steps, a belief the poor man's own guilt made all too easy to plant and to tend. She had torn the naming pages from the diary. She had waited a decent interval and had married the widower, and for 18 years she had been the mistress of the house she had killed to win, and she had worn her victim's locket at her throat, turned inward, all that time, as some murderers cannot help but keep the one thing that would damn them, out of a vanity deeper than fear. Then, this autumn, the dead woman had begun to walk. A grieving daughter, armed with half a truth, had raised a ghost, to torment a confession out of the wrong parent. And Cordelia, watching her husband crack, watching a detective arrive from London and begin to ask about lockets and currants and medicine, had seen her 20-year secret rising toward the surface like a drowned thing, and had done the only thing her nature knew how to do. She had killed again, cleanly and patiently, to keep the water still. "Everything hangs now," said Holmes, opening his eyes, "on that locket. Prove it is Beatrice's. Prove it has been on Cordelia's neck all these years. And the two deaths, locked together into a single truth, no jury on earth could refuse. Without it, I have a frightened old man dead of his weak heart, and a great deal of suspicion, and nothing a lawyer could not tear to shreds. Tonight, Watson, I mean to have that locket, and I mean to have it in front of witnesses, in a way that gives her no room to lie. Go and ask Lady Cordelia, with my compliments, whether she will receive us all in the drawing-room this evening. Tell her the great detective wishes to explain how her husband died. She will not refuse. She will be far too curious and far too confident to refuse." They gathered in the great drawing-room that evening as the light failed, and Watson, who had seen Holmes stage many such reckonings, thought he had never seen the stakes higher nor the ground more treacherous. For there was no confession on the table, no witness to the crime, no weapon but a bottle of heart drops and a woman's 20-year silence. There was only Holmes, and what Holmes could make them see. Lady Cordelia received them all with perfect composure, dressed in the first mourning she had already found time to have prepared, and she seated herself by the fire with her hands folded and her handsome face grave and attentive, for all the world the grieving widow indulging the eccentric detective her husband had so unwisely summoned. Vivian sat pale and straight, watching Holmes with a desperate trust. Julian stood by the window, hollow-eyed and silent. Dr. Ferrara had the look of a man who knows a storm is coming and has chosen not to leave the house, and in the shadows by the door stood old Benedetti in her black, and Matteo the boatman, cap in his weathered hands, both summoned by Holmes and neither knowing why. Holmes took his place before the fire, and for a moment he said nothing at all, letting the silence stretch until the ticking of the clock seemed to fill the room. "You have all been told," he began at last, in a quiet conversational tone that was somehow more arresting than any dramatics, "that Sir Edmund Harcourt died last night of heart failure, frightened past the endurance of a weak heart by the ghost of his first wife, and that is very nearly the truth. It is the truth polished and turned, so that its cruelest edge does not show. My task tonight is to turn it back, and show you the edge, because a man is dead who need not have died, and a woman lies 20 years in the deep water who was put there by human hands, and I do not intend to leave this beautiful house until both of those facts have been spoken aloud in this room." He spoke first of the ghost, and here he was gentle, and he did not name Vivian, though everyone in the room came slowly to understand of whom he spoke. There was no ghost, he said. There had never been a ghost. There had been a grief so deep and so long buried that it had risen at last and put on white and walked upon the water, seeking a truth that had been stolen from it. That grief had believed, wrongly, that it knew who the guilty party was. It had aimed itself at an innocent man, and in doing so it had been used, without its knowledge, as the perfect cover for a murder. The person who walked upon the water was guilty of nothing but love and misdirected grief, and Holmes would hear no word spoken against her, then or ever. Then he turned to the death of Sir Edmund, and the room grew very still. He laid it out step by step, without haste. The weak heart, the digitalis, that steadies a failing heart in the right measure and stops it altogether in the wrong one. The dismissal of the nurse a fortnight since. The medicine passing for those last 2 weeks through one pair of hands alone. And the bottle, he said, producing it from his pocket, sealed and signed across the seal by Dr. Ferrara, the bottle from which far more medicine was gone than any safe dosing could explain. "Someone in this house," said Holmes, "gave Sir Edmund far more of this medicine than his heart could bear over many nights, so that his death, when the terror of the storm finally came to finish the work, would look exactly like what everyone expected it to look like. The ghost was the weapon everyone would see. The poison was the weapon no one would look for, and the two together made a murder that was very nearly perfect." It was here that Lady Cordelia spoke for the first time, and her voice was calm and kind, and touched with just the right measure of sorrow. It was a dreadful thing, she said, to suggest, and she did not know whether to be angry or to pity Mr. Holmes for the strain his profession must place upon his mind. Her husband had dosed himself, surely, in his terror, or the poor nurse had been careless before she left. As for herself, she had given Edmund his drops with her own hands only out of love, because in his fear he would take them from no one else, and to hear that tenderness now turned into an accusation of murder was almost more than a grieving widow should be asked to bear. And she touched a handkerchief to her dry eyes, and the performance was so complete that Watson saw Julian glance at her uncertainly, half persuaded, and saw even Ferrara waver. Holmes let her finish. He let the doubt settle over the room like the mist over the lake, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, and Watson knew the change, for it was the voice his friend used only when he was about to close a door that could never again be opened. "You are quite right, Lady Cordelia," he said softly. "The bottle alone would never hang you. A clever counsel would do exactly as you have just done, and raise the careless nurse, and the self-dosing invalid, and the grieving wife, and no jury would be sure. If your husband's death stood alone, you would walk out of this room a free woman, and I should be an old fool who had strained his mind. But it does not stand alone. It has a sister, 20 years older, lying in the deep water off the drowned jetty, and it is the two of them together, madam, joined by a single small object of silver, that will put the rope about your neck. Shall I tell them now, or will you?" And for the first time since they had entered the house, Lady Cordelia Harcourt was silent. The gracious smile was still upon her lips, but it had frozen there, and her grey eyes had gone flat and hard and very quick, moving from Holmes to the sealed bottle to the faces around the room, calculating, and Watson saw her hand begin to rise toward the high collar at her throat, and stop, and return with a great effort of will to her lap. And in that single arrested gesture, that hand reaching for her own throat and forced back down, Watson understood at last what Holmes had been building toward all along, and he felt the hair rise on his arms. Holmes did not raise his voice. He never did at these moments. He turned to the room, and he began to take apart, piece by piece, the accident that had never been an accident. And as he spoke, Watson watched 20 years of careful lies come undone in the space of a few quiet minutes. "Consider first," said Holmes, "what everyone in this house has believed for 20 years, that Sir Edmund, in a drunken rage, followed his wife down to the boat-house on a stormy night and pushed her, or let her fall, from the wet stone steps into the lake. He believed it himself. He confessed it, poor man, with his dying breath last night upon that very landing. 'I let you fall,' he said, and every soul who heard him took it for the confession of a murderer. But it was nothing of the kind. It was the false memory of an innocent man, planted and watered for 20 years by the person who profited from it. And I can prove it false, not by anything so uncertain as a man's word, but by the water itself. Beatrice Harcourt,' he said, "was not found near the boat-house steps. She was found half a mile out, in the deep channel by the drowned jetty. And the oldest fisherman on the lake, a man who has read these waters for 60 years, would tell them, as he had told Holmes, that the current along that shore runs always southward, hugging the bank, toward the village. A body that went into the water at the boathouse steps would be carried toward the church and found in the reeds within a day. It could not, by any working of nature, travel half a mile out against the current into the deep channel. To reach the place where Beatrice was found, she had to be carried there. By a boat. There was no other way. The lake does not swim uphill. And who, said Holmes, could have rowed her out to the deep channel that night? Not Sir Edmund. Sir Edmund could not swim, feared deep water since boyhood, and by his own account, and the account of every servant in this house, has not set foot in a boat in 20 years. He physically could not have put his wife where she was found. The man confessed for 20 years to a murder he was incapable of committing. Someone let him believe it. Someone needed him to believe it. Someone who could handle a boat as well as any man on the lake, who rowed out alone in the grey dawns before the household woke, whom the fishermen of Bellagio called, in those days, the Shadow, because she followed the bright lady everywhere, one step behind, and she was as much at home upon the water as her mistress was upon the land. You were her companion, Lady Cordelia, said Holmes. Cordelia Vane, the quiet woman in grey. You wanted her life, and you took it, on the water, in the dark, where the current would keep your secret. You let a drunken, grieving husband believe his own hand had done it, because a guilty man asks no questions, and you tended that guilt in him for 20 years the way a gardener tends a poisonous vine, until it had all but killed him on its own. Then, when a ghost began to walk, and a detective came from London, you finished the work with a bottle of heart drops, so that the man who had taken the blame for your first murder would carry it, conveniently, into his grave, and close the book forever. Lady Cordelia's composure did not break, but it hardened. When she spoke, her voice was still calm, but the warmth had gone out of it entirely, and what remained was cold and flat and clear. A pretty story, she said, a very pretty story, built on the tale of an old fisherman in his cups, and the direction of a current no court could measure 20 years after the fact. He had a body in the deep water, and a woman who could row a boat, and from that he had spun a hanging. Where was his proof? Where was the single object of silver he had promised would put a rope about her neck? Let him produce it, if he had it. Let him stop talking and produce it. Holmes turned away from Lady Cordelia, and he beckoned instead to the old housekeeper in the shadows. Signora Benedetti came forward into the firelight, and Holmes asked her, gently, to tell the room once more what she had told him on the first night, about the first Lady Harcourt, and the thing she wore always at her throat. And the old woman, fixing Cordelia with a stare of 20 years' patience, described it. A locket of old silver, worn always, never once removed in life, and upon its face, worked into the metal by a craftsman in the north, a small bird, a kingfisher, wings folded, as it sits upon a branch above the water. She had dressed the drowned lady for her grave, Benedetti said, and the locket that should have lain upon that cold throat was gone, and she had known in her heart, for 20 years, that no lake unclasps a chain. Holmes turned back to Lady Cordelia, and he crossed the room to where she sat, and he stood over her, and extended his open hand, palm upward, and he asked her, with a courtesy more dreadful than any accusation, if she would be so kind as to show the company what she wore beneath the high collar at her throat. She did not move. She looked up at him with her flat grey eyes, and the whole room held its breath, and for a long moment the only sound was the clock. Then Vivian rose from her chair. Slowly, like a woman in a dream, the daughter of the murdered woman crossed the room and stood before her stepmother, and it was Vivian, not Holmes, who reached out with a steady hand and drew aside the black lace at Cordelia's throat. And there it was, an old locket of tarnished silver on a fine chain, worn turned inward against the skin, as it had been worn every day for 20 years. Vivian turned it over in her fingers, and upon its face, worn but unmistakable in the firelight, was a small silver bird with folded wings. A kingfisher sitting above the water, her mother's locket, the locket that had been on Beatrice Harcourt's living throat and gone from her drowned one, on the throat now of the woman who had taken it as her trophy in the black water 20 years before, and had not been able, in all that time, to part with it. For a long moment, the two women looked at one another, the daughter and the murderer, the locket between them on its chain. And then Lady Cordelia Harcourt did the thing that Watson would remember longest of all. She did not weep, she did not deny it. The mask simply fell away, and what lay beneath it was not madness, and not remorse, but a cold and settled certainty. The face of a woman who had made her choice 20 years ago and had never once, in all the nights since, regretted it. She had been born with nothing, she said, and had spent her youth a step behind a woman who had been born with everything and deserved none of it. Beatrice had been careless with her happiness, careless with her husband, careless with the beautiful life that had been handed to her, and Cordelia had watched, year after year, and had known that she herself would have been worthy of it, would have kept it, would have deserved it. So she had taken it. It had been the easiest thing in the world, she said, on the water, in the dark, with a frightened, careless woman who could not swim, and she had lived 18 good years as the mistress of this house, and she did not repent of a single one of them. As for Edmund, he had been dying by inches anyway, a weak and guilt-ridden old fool, and she had merely spared them all a longer wait. She said it all in the calm, gracious voice she had used to welcome them to the house, and it was the most chilling thing Watson had ever heard a human being say. "You wore it," said Vivian at last in a whisper, "all these years, at our table, over your heart. You wore my mother's locket over your heart, and you called me daughter, and you gave my father his medicine with your own hands." She did not shout, she did not strike her. She simply drew the chain from around Cordelia's neck, slowly, and closed it in her fist, and turned away, and walked back across the room to stand beside her mother's true avenger, the strange, calm detective from London who had given her back the truth, and in doing so had given her back her father, guiltless at the last. And Lady Cordelia sat alone by the fire, unrepentant and undone, and waited, with the same terrible composure, for whatever was to come. There remained the question of what was to be done. Holmes had already, that afternoon, foreseen how the evening might end, and had sent Watson quietly down to Bellagio with a message for the Italian authorities, so that even now a launch of the Carabinieri lay waiting at the village quay for the word to cross. But it was late, and the lake was black, and it was agreed that Lady Cordelia would be kept under watch in the house until the morning, when she would be given into the hands of the law and the long machinery of justice would begin its work. She made no protest. She sat by the fire with the same terrible composure she had worn all evening, and when they left her under the eye of a manservant, she wished them, in her low, gracious voice, a pleasant good night, exactly as she had done on the evening they arrived. Watson slept badly, and Holmes, he suspected, did not sleep at all, for his friend had said as they parted for the night, a thing that lodged in Watson's mind and would not let him rest. "A woman who is not afraid of the deep water," Holmes had said, "is a woman who has already made her peace with it. Watch the lake, Watson. She will not wait for the morning." And she did not wait. In the grey hour before dawn, when the mist lay thick upon the water and the manservant had at last fallen asleep in his chair, Lady Cordelia Harcourt let herself quietly out of the house, went down through the silent garden to the boat-house, and took a skiff out onto the lake. "Watson," roused by Holmes at the first sound, reached the terrace in time to see the little boat already well out upon the water, and the straight-backed figure of the woman rowing it, with long, easy, unhurried strokes, out toward the deep channel by the drowned jetty, out toward the place where she had put Beatrice Harcourt into the black water 20 years before. But Holmes had foreseen this too. Out of the mist from the village side came the low, dark shape of the Carabinieri launch, its lantern swinging, and cutting across the water ahead of it came Matteo, in his own skiff, the old boatman who had pulled Beatrice from the deep and had loved her, rowing now with all the strength of 20 years toward the woman who had drowned her. The launch closed from one side and Matteo from the other, and Lady Cordelia, out in the deep channel with the mist around her and the black water beneath her, shipped her oars and sat very still and looked down for a long moment into the water that had kept her secret, and looked up at the boats closing upon her, and did not move again. They took her without a struggle. Whatever she had rowed out to the deep channel to do, whether to escape across the lake, or to look one last time upon the grave she had made, or something colder and more final than either, she did none of it, for the law reached her first, out on the still water where she had believed herself safe forever. And as the launch turned back toward the village with the straight-backed figure of Lady Cordelia seated in its stern, the sun came up at last over the eastern mountains, and the mist burned away, and the lake lay revealed, calm and blue and beautiful and utterly indifferent, as it had lain on the morning they found Beatrice, and on every morning of the 20 years between. Lady Cordelia Harcourt was tried at Como through the winter, and the two deaths, joined by a locket of tarnished silver and the direction of a current, proved a chain that no counsel could break. The verdict, when it came, was the one the law provided, and Watson did not attend to hear it, for Holmes had no taste for the ends of these things, and neither, by then, had he. It was enough that the truth had been spoken aloud in that firelit room. It was enough that an innocent man's name had been lifted, too late for him to know it, from a crime he never committed. For the truth, Holmes said, was the only thing he had to give the living, and he had given it. Sir Edmund Harcourt had died believing himself a murderer, and there was no undoing that cruelty. But his daughter now knew that he had been an innocent and a broken man, deceived and used and grieving, and that he had loved her mother to his last breath, and that his last words upon the landing had been not the confession of a killer, but the anguish of a man mourning a fall he could not have prevented. Vivian took some comfort in it. In time, Watson believed, she took a great deal. She inherited the villa, as her father had wished, and she did not shut it up as a house of grief, but opened its windows and let the light in, and Matteo stayed on at the water, and old Benedetti sat in the sun in the garden, and was, for the first time in 20 years, at peace, for the thing she had known in her heart and could not prove had been spoken at last, and the drowned lady's locket lay now where it belonged, at the throat of her daughter, worn openly in the light. Julian, chastened and poorer, and perhaps a little wiser, went away to make what he could of the small legacy and the letter his uncle had left him, and Watson never learned what became of him, and hoped, on the whole, that it was better than the young man had deserved. Holmes and Watson took their leave, a few days after the arrest, when the worst of it was done, and there was no more that Holmes could usefully do. Vivian came down to the water steps to see them off, pale still and grave, but with something settled in her now that had not been there before, and she tried to thank Holmes, and could not find the words, and Holmes, who was never easy with gratitude, spared her the trouble of it. He took her hand, and he told her only that she should go on singing her mother's songs, for they were beautiful, and they belonged to the living now, and not to the dark water, and Vivian smiled at that, the first true smile Watson had seen upon her face, and it changed her wholly, and Watson understood for a moment what her mother must have been. They stood at the rail as the steamer carried them out across the lake, and the villa of shadow fell away behind them, pale and quiet in the morning sun, its windows open now to the light. Watson watched it go and thought of all that had happened beneath that painted ceiling, and of the patient cruelty that had lived so long in so beautiful a place. And he said something of the sort to Holmes, about how strange it was that such things could hide in such beauty. "Not strange at all," said Holmes, watching the villa recede. "Beauty is the finest hiding place there is. No one thinks to look for the shadow in the sunlight. That is why the cruelest things so often wear the fairest faces, Watson, and smile, and offer you both their hands, and tell you they are glad you have come. I have found it a useful thing to remember. I commend it to you." He was silent a moment, and very quietly, almost to himself, he added something Watson did not expect. "And yet the daughter opened the windows. Remember that too. For every shadow that waits 20 years to do its work, there is a grief that waits 20 years to set the truth free. On the whole, I find I would rather remember the second than the first." And with that, he turned his face to the front, toward the far end of the lake and the road home to London, and the fog and the fire, and whatever new stranger's letter might be waiting on the mantel, and he did not look back at the villa of shadow again. The steamer carried them out over the deep channel, where the water was black and cold, and had no bottom that any man had found, and the lake lay calm beneath them, keeping its old secrets and its new peace, and singing, if it sang at all, only to itself. The phantom of Lake Como never walked again. She had said what she came to say, and the truth had answered her, and the dead, at last, were allowed to rest. And on still autumn nights, the old people of Bellagio say, if you stand at the water's edge when the mist comes down, you may still hear, very faint and very far away, a woman singing a lullaby with no words. But they do not close their shutters against it any more, for they know now whose voice it was and what it wanted, and that it found, in the end, the one thing the dead so rarely find in this world. They know that it found the truth, and they know that the truth, however late it comes, and however much it costs, is the only thing that has ever laid a ghost to rest.